The great hall of the Galactic Conclave was big enough to swallow a city. Its ceiling stretched so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top. The walls were made of dark crystal that caught the light of 1,000 stars through massive windows. 34 species sat in curved rows around a central platform, their seats arranged by power and age. The oldest and most powerful sat closest to the center. Everyone else sat where they were told. Humanity sat near the back. Ambassador Elena Vasquez had been doing this job for 11 years. She had sat in that same chair in that same back row and watched the powerful races of the galaxy make decisions that affected billions of people without ever asking those people what they wanted. She had learned to keep her face calm. She had learned to keep her voice steady. She had learned, above all, to listen very carefully. Because in rooms like this one, the most important things were never said out loud. Today felt different. She noticed it the moment she walked in. The Vreth delegates were not looking at their datapads the way they usually did. They were looking at her, all 5 of them in their tall silver robes, with their 4 pale eyes each and their wide, flat faces. They were watching her the way a person watches something they are about to step on. She sat down, she opened her datapad, she waited. The session began like every other session. A conclave speaker read out the agenda in the common tongue: trade disputes, border corrections, a resource conflict in the outer ring that had been going on for decades and would probably go on for decades more. Vasquez made small notes. She drank her water. She listened. Then the speaker paused. He looked down at his datapad for a long moment. Then he said the words that changed everything. We will now move to the special agenda item, submitted by the Vreth hegemony and co-signed by 22 member states. The item concerns the status of the Terran Union and its continued membership in the Galactic Conclave. The hall went very quiet. Vasquez set down her stylus. High Chancellor Sovreth of the Vreth hegemony rose from his seat at the center of the hall. He was tall even for a Vreth, with a long neck and hands that had too many fingers. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and cold, like something that had never been warm. He spoke for 40 minutes. He talked about humanity's expansion, the new colonies humans had built in 3 different star systems over the last 20 years. He called this aggressive territorial seizure. He talked about human culture spreading to younger species who had not yet found their own way. He called this cultural contamination. He talked about human technology developing faster than the Conclave had predicted. He called this a threat to galactic stability. He never once raised his voice. He never once looked at Vasquez directly. He spoke about humanity the way someone might speak about a pest problem, unfortunate, inconvenient, and in need of a solution. When he finished, the vote was called. The result came in less than 3 minutes. 28 in favor, 6 against. The Galactic Conclave formally declared war on the Terran Union. The 6 races that voted against were small ones. The Queth, a quiet insectoid species. The Harani, who lived on ocean worlds and rarely sent more than 2 delegates. 4 others whose names most of the galaxy struggled to pronounce. They were good people. They were powerless people. Vasquez made a note of each of their names. After the vote, Sovreth turned and looked at her for the first time. He gave her what passed for a smile on a Vreth face, a slight tightening around the eyes, a small downward curve of the mouth. He told her that the Terran Union had 30 cycles to comply. 30 cycles to hand over all colonies outside the original human star system. 30 cycles to disarm the Terran Defense Force down to a peacekeeping level. 30 cycles to accept a conclave-appointed oversight council that would govern human expansion going forward. If these terms are not met, Sovreth said, the conclave will act. I think you understand what that means, Ambassador. Around the hall, many of the delegates were already talking among themselves. Some were laughing. Not loudly, they were too polished for that, but she could see it in the way they leaned toward each other, in the quick glances they threw her way. They thought this was already finished. They thought humanity would look at 28 warring species and do the only sensible thing. They thought she was afraid. Vasquez closed her datapad. She did it slowly, with both hands, smoothing the cover flat the way her grandmother used to smooth a tablecloth before a meal. She picked up her water glass and finished what was left in it. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and looked at Savrith across the great hall. "High Chancellor," she said, and her voice carried clearly because the hall was still listening, "I have heard the conclave's position. I will pass it along to my government." She paused for exactly one breath. "You have made a terrible mistake. We will be in touch." She picked up her datapad. She walked to the exit. Her footsteps were the only sound in the entire hall for several long seconds. Behind her she heard laughter. Actual laughter, now that they thought she couldn't see their faces. She heard Savrith say something in his own language, and she heard other voices respond with amusement. She did not stop walking. She did not look back. She stepped through the great doors and into the corridor outside, where her assistant, a young man named Piero, was waiting with wide eyes and a pale face. "Ambassador," he said, "what do we do?" Vasquez looked at him for a moment. Then she did something that surprised him. She smiled. Not a forced smile, not a polite smile. A real one, small and quiet, the kind that meant something she wasn't saying out loud. "We send a message home," she said. "Priority 1, full encryption, direct to the War Council." Piero blinked. "The War Council, Ambassador, that council hasn't been officially convened since." "Since the contingency plans were last reviewed, yes," she said. "Convene them now. Tell Admiral Nakamura that Omega is a go." She started walking down the corridor. "Then book us passage back to Earth. We won't be coming back here for a while." Piero hurried to keep up. What should the message to Nakamura say exactly? Vasquez thought about the hall behind her. She thought about Savrith's smile. She thought about 28 species laughing at the back row humans who were supposed to bow their heads and comply. She thought about every year she had spent in that chair, in that hall, being spoken over and looked past and treated like a minor problem that hadn't been properly dealt with yet. She thought about what she knew that they didn't. She thought about the ships, the real ones, the ones that didn't appear in any document the Conclave had ever been allowed to see. "Tell her," Vasquez said, "that they voted, and tell her that they have no idea what they just voted for." Piero sent the message. 34 species went home that night believing the war was already won, that humanity would count the numbers, measure the fleets, look at the odds, and understand that resistance was pointless, that within 30 cycles, human ambassadors would return to the Conclave with their heads down and their signatures ready. They had studied human history, of course, or they thought they had. They knew about the wars humans had fought among themselves. They knew about the violence, but they had drawn the wrong lesson from it. They thought it meant humans broke easily. They had not read carefully enough. Because anyone who had truly read human history, all of it, the long and bloody and stubborn length of it, would have noticed one very important thing. Humans had been backed into corners before, many times, by enemies stronger than them, better supplied than them, more numerous than them. They had never once stayed in the corner. The Conclave went to sleep that night confident and comfortable. Across the galaxy, in the quiet dark of space, something very old and very patient began to wake up. The message arrived on Earth at 3:47 hours, ship time. It came in on a Priority 1 channel that most people in the Terran Union government had never actually seen used before. It bypassed normal communication networks entirely, went through 3 layers of military encryption, and landed directly in the personal terminal of Admiral Hira Nakamura, who was sitting at her desk in the Terran Defense Command building outside Geneva, drinking tea and reading a report she had been expecting for years. She read Vasquez's message twice. Then she set down her tea. Then she picked up the secure line and made 6 calls, one after another, each lasting less than 30 seconds. By 500 hours, the Emergency War Council was assembled. They met in a room deep underground, a room with no windows, no outside connections, and walls thick enough to stop anything short of a direct hit from a capital ship. 14 people sat around a plain metal table. No decorations, no ceremony. They all knew why they were there. Nakamura stood at the head of the table. She was 63 years old, small and lean, with short gray hair and the kind of stillness that came from spending 40 years doing the hardest job there was. She had never fought in a war. She had spent her entire career making sure humanity was ready for one. She put the Conclave's war declaration on the table in front of them. She let everyone read it. She gave them 2 minutes. Then she said, "Omega." One word, everyone in the room understood it. For the people outside that room, for ordinary citizens, for foreign governments, for the Conclave's intelligence services, the Terran Defense Force was a modest military. Respectable, professional, equipped for border protection and peacekeeping. The Conclave's most recent intelligence estimate, gathered through years of careful observation and occasional spy work they thought humanity didn't know about, put the human fleet at around 200 warships, medium-class vessels mostly. Nothing extraordinary. That estimate was wrong by a very large number. The truth was something humanity had kept hidden for 60 years, since the early days of Conclave membership, when a few very quiet, very serious people in the Terran government had looked at the galaxy around them and asked a simple question: what happens if they turn on us? No one had wanted to ask it out loud. It wasn't polite. It wasn't diplomatic. But the people who asked it quietly in private rooms were the kind of people who had read history. Human history, the long, brutal, honest record of what happened to civilizations that were unprepared when the strong decided to take from the weak. They had drawn their conclusions, and then they had gone to work. Contingency Omega had been built slowly, piece by piece, over 6 decades. Shipyards hidden inside asteroids in the outer reaches of the solar system, research programs listed under civilian budget codes, weapons development disguised as mining technology. Every few years, the plan was reviewed, updated, improved. Every generation of military leadership added something new to it. Nakamura herself had spent the last 15 years refining it, running simulations, stress-testing the assumptions, looking for weaknesses. She had found very few. The council members listened as she began to lay it out. She was calm and precise. She spoke the way she always spoke, without drama, without decoration, just fact after fact, delivered in a voice that made each one feel like something solid you could hold in your hand. The real fleet numbered over 1,400 combat vessels, not the medium-class ships the Conclave thought it knew about. True warships, heavy cruisers, carrier platforms, fast attack ships built for deep space combat. They had been constructed quietly over decades and stored in distributed locations across human-controlled space, many of them hidden in places the Conclave had never looked because they had never thought to look. Beyond the ships, there were the drone swarms, hundreds of millions of small autonomous combat units, each one cheap to build and impossible to stop in sufficient numbers, all of them networked through an adaptive AI system that could learn enemy tactics in real time and rewrite its own strategy faster than any biological commander could think. The Conclave had nothing like it. No one in the galaxy had anything like it, as far as humanity's intelligence services could determine. There were the stealth systems, technology that made ships effectively invisible to every form of sensor the Conclave used. It had taken 30 years to develop and had been tested thoroughly in the outer systems without anyone noticing. The Conclave's admirals had built their war plans around knowing where human ships were. They were about to find out how badly that assumption would fail them. And then there were the soldiers. Nakamura did not spend much time on this part. She simply said that Terran ground forces were not what the Conclave believed they were. Enhancement programs, biological and mechanical, had been running for 2 decades. Human soldiers were faster than any Vreth fighter, stronger and able to operate in conditions that would kill most species. They healed faster. They endured more. They kept going longer. She paused at this point because one of the council members, a civilian, the Minister of Civil Affairs, raised his hand and asked a question that was not about strategy. "Should we attempt negotiations first?" he asked. 30 cycles is time enough to. "No," Nakamura said. She said it gently because she understood why he was asking. "They did not offer us negotiation. They offered us surrender with a deadline. If we go back to that table now, every species in the galaxy will see us do it, and they will understand what it means." She looked at him steadily. "We will not kneel, not today, not because they told us to." The minister nodded slowly and said nothing more. The vote was unanimous, all 14 hands. The Terran Union would not comply with the Conclave's terms. The Terran Union would fight. Nakamura gave her orders over the next 6 hours, a cascade of instructions going out to fleet commanders, research facilities, supply networks, and field officers across human space, all of it moving through encrypted channels the Conclave could not read. The machinery of Omega began to move for the first time in its 60-year existence. It moved smoothly because it had been designed to move smoothly. Every person who received an order knew their role. Every system that was activated responded as it was supposed to. Decades of preparation coming to life all at once. Before she left the room, Nakamura drafted the Terran Union's official response to the Conclave's declaration. It was short. She read it aloud to the council before sending it, and the room was very quiet while she did. It said, "The Terran Union acknowledges the Conclave's 30-cycle ultimatum. We suggest the Conclave use that time wisely. Say goodbye to the people you love. You are going to want to have done that." Someone in the council let out a slow breath. Someone else made a sound that was almost a laugh, not because it was funny, but because there was something in it that felt true and final and right. The message was sent. On a colony world called Kepler's Reach, 3 days' travel from Earth, automated systems began to come online, systems that had been sitting dormant for years, waiting. Sensor grids expanded. Defense platforms unlocked. Deep in the asteroid fields beyond the colony's outer orbit, ghost ships that had floated dark and silent for years powered up their engines one by one. They made no noise. They gave off no signal the Conclave could detect. They simply began to move quietly into position. The Conclave did not see them coming. They never did. Fleet Commander Drexel of the Vreth hegemony had fought in 4 wars. He had burned 2 colony worlds that refused Conclave authority. He had destroyed fleets, taken prisoners, and written reports about enemy casualties in the same tone that other people used to discuss weather. He was not a cruel creature by nature. He simply did his job, and his job had always been to win, and he had always won. He was not worried about Kepler's Reach. His fleet numbered 812 warships. Even accounting for the inflated estimates, his intelligence officers always warned him not to trust entirely. He had been told that humanity's full military presence in the Kepler's Reach system consisted of a single defense station, 3 patrol cruisers, and some planetary ground fortifications. He was coming with 800 ships. He gave the order to drop out of warp at 600 hours on the 4th day of the war. The fleet came out of warp in good order, spread across a wide formation the way doctrine required. Sensors came online immediately. Drexel stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his officers begin their standard system sweep, cataloging what was in front of them, building the picture, preparing the targeting solutions. The picture that came back was wrong. Not wrong in a small way. Wrong in the way that made experienced officers go very still and speak very quietly, and check their readings twice, and then a 3rd time because the numbers could not be right. The defense station was there. The patrol cruisers were there, but so was something else, a lot of something else. Weapons platforms, hundreds of them, arranged in overlapping fields of fire around the planet, powered up and locked on. Orbital mines. Seated across the approach vectors in patterns that blocked every clean line of advance. And ships that had simply appeared from nowhere, dropping some kind of stealth field simultaneously, all at once, like a curtain being pulled back. Not 3 cruisers, not 30. 419 warships, sitting in formation, already oriented toward his fleet, already locked and ready. They had been waiting. "Sir," his sensor officer said very quietly, "those ships, they weren't there. There was no signal, no power signature, nothing, they just—" "I can see what they did," Drexel said. His voice was steady. He had not gotten where he was by showing fear on his bridge. "Battle formation, all weapons hot, we proceed as planned." He believed at that moment that numbers would carry the day. He had 800 ships. They had 400. Even with the surprise, even with the platforms and the mines, the math still favored him. He had never done math like this before. The battle lasted 11 hours. In the first hour, his fleet drove forward through the minefield, taking losses, more losses than projected, because the mines moved. They were not static. They tracked. They adjusted. Several of his destroyers were simply gone before anyone understood what was happening. In the second and third hours, his main force engaged the human fleet directly, and he began to understand that his ships were not performing the way they should. Human vessels moved faster than the specs suggested. Their weapons hit harder. Their shielding absorbed more. Every time one of his captains thought he had found a pattern to exploit, the human ships changed their approach, not slowly, not after a delay, but immediately, as if they were reading his commander's minds. They were not reading minds. They were running on something else, something networked, something that processed information faster than any crew could and shared it across the entire fleet in real time. Drexel would learn this later. In the moment, it just felt like fighting something that couldn't be surprised. In the 5th hour, the drones came. They came from the asteroid belt beyond the planet, tiny things, each one barely worth a single shot, but they came in numbers that his point defense systems could not handle. Not thousands, millions. A cloud of them that rolled through space like a wave absorbing fire, losing units by the thousands and not slowing down at all because losing thousands out of millions meant nothing. They hit his rear formation and began taking apart ships with a patience and thoroughness that was almost mechanical. Because it was mechanical, because they were not afraid of dying, because they did not get tired. By the 8th hour, Drexel had lost more than 400 ships. He had destroyed 61 human vessels. He called for a retreat and found that the human fleet was already moving to cut off his escape vectors, not reactively, but as if they had planned for exactly this, as if retreat had always been part of the trap. He lost another 200 ships getting out. He made it out with 109, out of 812. His ship was damaged. Half his crew was dead. He sat in his command chair while his surviving officers worked in silence around him, and he tried to build a picture in his head of what had just happened. He tried to find the point where his plan had failed, where the mistake was, where the thing that went wrong had started. He could not find it, because the mistake had not happened during the battle. The mistake had happened long before it, in some room somewhere on Earth, when someone in the Conclave had decided that humanity was not worth taking seriously. He sent his report to the Conclave High Council. He sent it without softening the numbers, without diplomatic language, without the kind of careful phrasing officers used when they wanted to seem less defeated than they were. He sent the raw truth because he thought they needed it. The message said, "We lost 673 ships at Kepler's reach. Human losses were 61. They were prepared. They were completely prepared. They knew we were coming and they had been ready for years. Do not send another fleet until you understand what you are dealing with. I am not sure we do yet." 2 days later, his damaged ship was intercepted by a human vessel. He prepared for a fight that never came. Instead, a small group of human soldiers came aboard, not aggressive, weapons lowered, moving carefully. They treated his wounded. They gave his crew food and water. They spoke to him through a translation device in calm, plain language, and told him he was a prisoner of war, and that he would be treated according to the Terran Union's laws, which were very specific about how prisoners were to be handled. He had expected anger. He had expected punishment. He had expected the behavior of a species that had just been attacked and had defended itself with enormous violence. Instead, a young human medic sat next to one of his injured crew members for 3 hours, keeping the Vreth soldier calm while a bone-setting procedure took place, holding the alien's hand, a gesture that meant nothing in Vreth culture but which the human did instinctively, because to a human, sitting with someone in pain and not leaving them alone was simply what you did. Drexel watched this from across the medical bay and felt something that he did not have a good word for, something uncomfortable and large that sat in the middle of his chest. He had spent his whole career thinking of war as a math problem. Numbers of ships, numbers of casualties, resource costs versus strategic gains. These creatures didn't seem to think that way. They fought with the fury of something defending its home, and when the fighting was done, they turned around and treated the wounded enemy like a person. He didn't know what to do with that. He started writing a letter to the High Council, not a report this time, a warning. He wrote, "I have seen them fight and I have seen them stop fighting. I am not sure which one frightened me more. These creatures do not fight because they are ordered to. They fight because they choose to. And when they choose to, there is nothing in the galaxy like it. Do not make the mistake of thinking this was a setback. This is what they are. This is what we woke up." The High Council received the letter, they read it, they set it aside. They were already planning the next attack. They had not yet understood the most important thing about humanity, that every attack would not weaken them. Every attack would only make them more certain, more focused, more resolved. Every battle the Conclave started was a battle humanity would finish. And humanity was very, very good at finishing things. Admiral Nakamura had a rule. She had followed it for her entire career, and she had never once broken it. The rule was this: do not wait for the enemy to come to you twice. After Kepler's reach, she gave the Conclave 4 days. 4 days for the news to spread, for their admirals to receive their reports, for their councils to argue and panic and reorganize. She wanted them off balance before she moved. She wanted them reacting, not planning. She wanted them looking at the place they had already hit and worrying about it while her fleets were already somewhere else entirely. On the 5th day, she went on offense. It was not loud. It was not one massive strike that lit up every sensor in the galaxy. It was quiet, precise, and it happened in 17 places at once. Supply depots in the outer systems. Communication relay stations that the Conclave used to coordinate fleet movements. Shipyards tucked behind gas giants where Vreth vessels were being repaired and restocked. Fuel lines that stretched across 3 star systems feeding the Conclave's forward forces. The ghost ships moved through the dark without a signal, without a sound. They hit their targets and were gone before the enemy could respond. In some cases, Conclave stations didn't even know they'd been attacked until systems started going offline. A communication station in the Vreth Outer Territory simply stopped transmitting. A supply depot near the Conclave's 3rd Fleet was there 1 hour and a debris field the next. No alarm had gone out. No distress signal had been sent. Because there had been no time. Within a week, the Conclave's ability to coordinate across its outer territories had dropped by 40%. Their 3rd Fleet, which had been preparing to launch a second assault, found itself without fuel and spare parts and unable to move. Their admirals sent requests for resupply and received confused responses from stations that were no longer there. Nakamura read the intelligence reports each morning over her tea and made small notes on a physical paper map, she kept on her desk, old habit, something her grandfather had done. Every day more marks, every day the picture shifting in humanity's favor. She did not celebrate. She did not allow herself to feel satisfied. She had seen enough history to know that the most dangerous moment in any war was when you started thinking you were winning. She kept moving. The diplomatic teams followed the military advances, which was not how most species conducted war. Where human fleets secured a system, a small team of diplomats arrived within days, not to occupy, not to demand loyalty, but to talk. To explain clearly and honestly that the Terran Union had no interest in punishing species that had voted for the war declaration under Vreth pressure. To lay out simple terms, stand down and nothing bad would happen to you. Continue fighting, and nothing good would happen to you either. Several species accepted within the first month. A small reptilian race called the Teshari, who had always been more afraid of the Vreth than they were loyal to them, sent a quiet message to Vasquez saying they had never wanted this war and would take no further part in it. The Murak, a species of amphibian traders with 17 colony worlds, calculated the new odds and made the rational choice within 2 weeks of the campaign's start. Each defection made the conclave a little smaller. Each withdrawal made Sovreth's coalition a little weaker. Then came the Queth. The Queth were small. They had 3 colony worlds, a fleet of 22 ships, and a population that any of the major species could have ignored entirely without feeling it. They had voted against the war declaration from the beginning. They had no military power worth mentioning. They had nothing to offer except their voice. But their ambassador, a quick-moving insectoid named Velquethtren, arrived at the Terran Union's forward command station on the 15th day of the war and asked to speak to someone in authority. He was brought to a conference room and given water and food. The Queth processed sugar well. And then a junior Terran officer sat down across from him and asked what he needed. What he needed, he said, was to formally ally the Queth people with the Terran Union, not in secret, publicly, on the record where everyone could see it. The officer asked why. The Queth were taking a serious risk. If the Conclave survived this war, the Queth would pay a very heavy price. Velquethtren was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that the officer wrote down afterward and included in his report because he thought it was important. He said, "We have watched humanity for 80 years. We have seen how you argue and how you disagree and how you sometimes make each other very angry. But we have also seen how you treat the small ones, how you notice us when the powerful do not, how you remember what it is to be the weak one in the room." He paused. "If you lose this war, we lose something the galaxy cannot afford to lose, so we would rather lose it standing next to you than watching from far away." The alliance was formalized within 3 hours. It went out on every public channel in the Conclave's communication network. The reaction was immediate. 17 Conclave member species contacted the Terran Union within 48 hours asking about terms for neutrality. The Conclave was fracturing. Sovreth saw it happening and did the thing that desperate leaders in losing positions often did. He stopped trying to win strategically and started trying to strike something that hurt. He stopped thinking about fleets and supply lines and started thinking about symbols. He chose Earth. The plan was straightforward. A strike fleet of 300 ships, everything he could still coordinate, would hit the Sol system directly. Earth was the heart of the Terran Union. Earth was where their government sat, where their history lived, where nearly 1 billion people still made their home. Destroy it, or even threaten it credibly enough, and the Union would have to pull back its forces, have to negotiate, have to stop the campaign that was dismantling the Conclave piece by piece. The strike fleet dropped out of warp into the Sol system, ready for a fight. They found something that stopped them dead for several long, terrible seconds. Earth was not undefended. It was not lightly defended. It was not even moderately defended. What they found around the 3rd planet of the human home system was the most heavily fortified position any of his admirals had ever seen in their lives. defense platforms in layered rings, an orbital grid of weapons emplacements that covered every possible approach angle. And waiting there in clean formation, a human fleet that numbered over 600 warships, ships that had not been committed to the outer campaign, ships that had been held back, saved specifically for this. Every vessel in the Vreth strike fleet was already being tracked. Target locks were established before they had finished their entry sweep. On all open frequencies, a human voice spoke. It was calm and it was clear. It said, "You have entered Terran Union sovereign space without permission. You are outnumbered and outgunned. This system has been held by humanity since before we knew anyone else existed in the universe. We suggest you think very carefully about the next thing you decide to do." Drexel, still a prisoner on a human facility elsewhere in the system, heard about the standoff through a guard who told him the news the way someone might describe something they had just watched out a window, matter of fact, almost bored. "They walked right into it," the guard said, shaking his head slightly. Drexel said nothing. He had been writing his letter to the High Council every day since his capture. He had been warning them every day. They had not listened. He thought about what he had seen on the human medical ship. He thought about the medic who had held his soldier's hand. He thought about the food they had given his crew and the respectful language they had used, and the laws they had cited to explain why prisoners had rights. He picked up his writing pad and continued the letter. He wrote, "I have tried to explain what these people are. I have tried to find the words. Let me try once more. They are not like us. They are not like anyone. They remember pain, and that memory makes them careful, and their carefulness makes them terrifying. You hit their home. You threatened everything they love, and they were ready. They are always ready. This is not a war we can win. This is not a war we ever could have won. The only question left is how much we lose before we understand that." He finished the letter. He sent it through the prisoner communication channel the humans had provided, because they had a prisoner communication channel, because their laws said prisoners could contact their governments, because that was the kind of species they were. This time, someone in the High Council read it all the way to the end. The Battle of Earth lasted 6 hours, not because it was close, but because 300 ships take time to destroy even when you are doing it efficiently. When it was over, humanity's losses numbered 11 ships. The Vreth strike fleet was gone. Sovrith received the news in silence. Then he sat for a long time doing nothing at all. His advisors waited. Finally, one of them asked what they should do next. Sovrith looked at the losses report. He looked at the numbers from every engagement over the past 8 weeks. He looked at the map of Conclave space and all the marks on it where human forces had struck, and the list of species that had withdrawn from the coalition one by one. He said, "Find out who humanity talks to about ending wars." It was the first smart decision he had made since the war began. The Vreth homeworld of Vretha Prime was a cold, gray place. Its cities were built from dark stone, tall and dense, full of sharp angles and narrow streets. Everything about it spoke of a people who valued order and control, streets that ran in perfect straight lines, buildings that never curved, a sky that was always the same pale shade of nothing, as if even the weather had been told to behave itself. It was a proud world. It had never been touched by outside forces. Not once in 600 years of Vreth history had an enemy fleet stood in orbit above it. Admiral Nakamura's fleet arrived on the 91st day of the war. She came with 400 ships. The Vreth had nothing left to meet them. What remained of the hegemony's fighting force was scattered and broken, some units hiding in deep space, some that had already surrendered to human advance teams, some that had simply gone dark and were no longer responding to orders. The Conclave itself had stopped functioning as a governing body 2 weeks earlier, when enough member species had withdrawn their support to make the council chamber unable to reach a legal vote on anything. Nakamura put her fleet in orbit above Vretha Prime and did not fire a single shot. She sent a message to the surface. She sent it in plain language, no encryption, on a frequency that every comm system on the planet could receive. She said, "This is Admiral Hira Nakamura of the Terran Defense Force. Vretha Prime is surrounded. The war is over. I am requesting direct contact with High Chancellor Sovrith to discuss terms. No one on this world will be harmed while those discussions take place. That is a promise from the Terran Union, and we keep our promises." It took 3 hours for Sovrith to respond. When he did, he looked smaller than Ambassador Vasquez remembered. Not physically, he was still tall, still wide-shouldered, still the same creature who had stood in the Great Hall of the Conclave and declared war with a cold smile on his face. But something in him had gone down. The way he sat, the way he held his hands, the way he looked at the camera with eyes that were steady but not confident. He connected directly to Vasquez, who was on Nakamura's flagship. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke. She thought he might say something proud, some final performance of strength before he gave in. He surprised her. He said, "I expected you to be angrier." "I am angry," Vasquez said. "I am very angry, but I am a professional and so are you, and we have work to do." She placed a document on the screen in front of him. She gave him a moment to begin reading it. It was called the Terran Peace Accord. Sovrith read it slowly. Then he read it again. Then he looked up at Vasquez with an expression she could not quite read. He had expected punishment. That was what you did when you won a war. You punished the loser. You took their territory. You put your own people in their government. You made them small so they could never threaten you again. Every species he knew did this. Every war in recorded galactic history had ended this way. The winner took what they could. That was how the universe worked. The Terran Peace Accord said none of that. It said the Vreth hegemony would pay reparations, a structured payment over 40 years that was significant but not designed to cripple their economy. It said Vreth military forces would be reduced to a level sufficient for defense only, and that this reduction would be verified by a neutral oversight body. It said that war crimes committed during the conflict, and there had been some, on a small Queth settlement that a Vreth commander had struck in defiance of orders, would be investigated and prosecuted through an independent court. And then it said something else, something Sovrith had not expected at all. It said the Galactic Conclave was to be dissolved and replaced by a new body, the Galactic Assembly. In this new assembly, every species would have equal representation regardless of size, power, or age. No species could be outvoted by simple majority on decisions that affected their own territory or people. Every species, even the smallest, even the ones with 3 colony worlds and 22 ships, would have a voice that counted for exactly as much as anyone else's. Sovrith looked up. "You are not taking any seats of power in this assembly." "No," Vasquez said. "You are nominating the Queth and 2 other minor species to the First Leadership Council." "Yes." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. She thought about how to say it and decided that simple and honest was better than anything clever. "Because we have been the small ones in the room," she said. "We remember what it felt like. We remember what it felt like to sit in the back row while the powerful ones made decisions that affected us without asking what we thought. We are not going to build the same room and just move to the front of it." Sovrith looked at the document for a long time. Outside the window behind Vasquez, he could see the edge of his planet's horizon, the gray-blue curve of Vretha Prime, floating in space with 400 human warships above it, and not a single weapon fired. He said, "You could have destroyed us." "Yes," she said. "You chose not to." "Yes." "Because of your laws." "Because of our memory," she said. "We remember what it felt like when someone tried to destroy us. We didn't fight this war to rule the galaxy. We fought it because you told us we had to kneel, and we don't kneel." She paused. "We never have." Sovrith signed the accord. He signed it with the same stylus he had used to sign the original war declaration, which Vasquez thought was either very ironic or very fitting, and she was not entirely sure which. The news spread across the galaxy within hours. The Galactic Conclave was finished. The Galactic Assembly would begin its first session in 60 days. Humanity, which had just won the most significant war in recent galactic history, declined every offer to take a leadership seat and went back to doing what it had always done, sending its people out into the dark, building things, talking to everyone, arguing loudly with itself, and somehow stubbornly surviving. Drexel was released from custody on the 93rd day of the war. He was given back his personal belongings, a clean change of clothes, and a meal before he left, because the humans had a rule about that. No one left a Terran facility without a meal. He didn't know why. He didn't ask. He ate the food and found it strange but not bad. A young human officer walked him to the transport that would take him home. They stood at the door for a moment in the awkward way that people stand when they know they are parting and are not quite sure what to say. Drexel said, "Your people are very strange." The officer considered this. "Probably," he said. "You fight like nothing I have ever seen," Drexel said. "And then you stop and you offer food to the people you were just fighting. I don't understand it." The officer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think it's because we've been on both sides. We've been the ones who had everything taken. We've been the ones doing the taking. We've tried it both ways," he shrugged. "The second way feels worse, even when you win." Drexel thought about this for a long time on the journey home. When he arrived on Vretha Prime, the first thing he did was go and see his family. His children were young enough that they didn't fully understand what had happened, what the war had meant, what they had almost lost. They were just glad to see him. They held onto his arms and asked him what space was like and whether he'd seen any interesting aliens. He told them yes, he had seen some very interesting aliens. Later that night, after the children were asleep, he sat at his desk and finished the letter he had been writing to the High Council throughout his captivity. He had been writing it for weeks. He had been trying to find the right words for weeks. He decided that he had finally found them. He wrote, "I have tried to explain what humanity is. I have tried to describe their weapons and their tactics and their technology, but none of that is what you need to understand. What you need to understand is this. They were ready because they were afraid of us. Not afraid the way a weak thing is afraid. Afraid the way an intelligent thing is afraid. The kind of fear that makes you work, that makes you prepare, that makes you stay up late and run simulations and build hidden fleets and keep secrets for 60 years, just in case. They were afraid of us, and that fear made them into something we couldn't beat. And when they beat us, when they stood above our world with 400 ships and all the power they needed to end us, they stopped. They stopped because their fear never made them cruel. It only made them ready. I have never encountered anything more dangerous in my life, and I have never encountered anything that gave me more reason to believe that the galaxy, in spite of everything, might be worth saving." He finished the letter. He sent it. He did not know if anyone would read it carefully this time. He hoped they would. He thought that perhaps in the new assembly, in the new way of doing things, there might be more people willing to listen carefully. More people willing to sit with uncomfortable things and think about them honestly. He hoped so. He went to bed. Above him, far away, the stars were the same as they had always been, old, quiet, indifferent to the small creatures moving through the dark between them. But the small creatures were not indifferent to each other. They were watching and learning and making decisions, some good and some terrible, and occasionally stumbling into something that changed everything. The Conclave had declared war on humanity, believing it would be quick and clean and easily forgotten. A minor correction, a small problem dealt with firmly. Instead, it had been the moment the galaxy learned what humanity actually was. Not the most powerful species, not the most ancient, not the wisest or the most advanced or the most perfectly evolved for survival in a hostile universe. Just the most stubborn, the most prepared, the most unwilling to be told that they had no right to stand where they stood. And perhaps, just perhaps, the most willing to win a war and then turn around and try to build something better out of the wreckage. The galaxy would not make the same mistake again. More importantly, the galaxy would not forget. And